Hello readers, welcome back to PJL Books and welcome to today's Off the Shelf. Today's Off the Shelf topic is I don't read. How often do you hear that? Well, probably not that much if we're being literal about it, but if we were to go out and do a quick survey of passers-by in the street and ask them these three questions, what are you watching, what are you playing, and what are you reading? The vast majority of people will gleefully rattle off their favourite TV show, well, their latest TV show, and the latest movie they've seen or video game they're currently digging. But when it comes to books, don't be surprised if many of them say they're reading nothing or simply forgot you asked the third question as they get so worked up telling you how great Community or Dark Souls 3 is. Why is that? I sincerely don't think that it's a case of hectic lifestyles combined with instant access to social media, internet and entertainment as squeezing books back, although that's certainly a factor. Nearly all forms of entertainment have benefited from the digital age, including books, if we're honest, but not nearly to the same degree of success that other media has had, especially music and TV, yeah? And no, I'm sorry, but the constant trumpeting of, oh, I've got a hectic lifestyle, no free time, utter bunk. People only associate the shrinking of free time with themselves, not as a collective whole. And surprise, surprise, we get older, we move up in the workplace, promotions, we start families perhaps, and we generally get a bit busier. People may get a bit more hectic lifestyle as they move up their own personal ladders, but as a collective whole, humankind has never had such a rich abundance of free time. We can now watch movies in cars, listen to music while walking from A to B, and we play mobile games on the toilet. Don't look at me like that, we've all done it. This is before we really get into the real pure free time in the evenings and weekends, yeah? When people will happily boast binge watching whole seasons of Game of Thrones. And yet, it's very rare that you hear about binge reading. Oh sure, reading sessions are pretty long by nature, and we've all heard of people waxing lyrical about a book they couldn't put down, and they read it from cover to cover in one go. But that brings me back to my first point. Imagine a group of your friends just talking, during a lunch hour or something. And, as these casual talks go, you tend to talk about the various media you've consumed recently, right? Movies, music, and things like that. Now, it would be strange if one of your friends declared he hadn't watched, played, or listened to anything recently, wouldn't it? You'd think that there was something wrong. But if one of your friends said they hadn't read a book recently, you'd probably consider that to be utterly normal. How has this happened? How has it become normal for reading to be such a sparse, even non-existent activity? How have we come to this point where adults will quite happily tell you, and I'm being serious here, without any hint of humour or shame, that a fully grown adult, will tell you that the last book they read was The Hungry Caterpillar? Now, smarter people than me have tried to answer this conundrum, but I'll throw my 2 cents in regardless. And again, that brings me back to my first point. Reading books has always had this air of exclusivity to them. Reading is by nature a very individual, insulated experience. TVs, movies and music can be enjoyed en masse with people, yeah? And in fact, that can amplify the enjoyment. But books are at their best when the book and the reader are alone in a bubble. Plus, TV, movies, video games and music are largely expensive affairs to put together, worked on by, small armies of people who need to be paid, who may in turn feed families. They can't afford to be exclusive about what they do. They must throw their arms as wide open as they dare to the audience in order to put food on the table. Books in that regard have the luxury of not having that weight on them. They can afford to be a little more niche because only one or so people rely on it, if they rely on it at all, to be honest. Add to that the relative ease of putting a quality book together compared to what's needed to put a movie or a TV show or an album together, and you have reasons why there's just so many books and authors out, way too many to keep up with, while it's relatively easy to stay up to date with, the biggest hits of the silver screen. And it's because of this that one can still walk into a commercial bookstore on the high street today and still pick up a book that is, in the grand scheme of things, a little bit obscure. At least your friends and family have never heard of that book or that author anyway. How often does that happen when you're talking about TV shows or movies or albums? Well, albums to a lesser extent, I suppose. But it's this fact that still gives the act of reading a kind of aloofness, setting the reader apart from the masses, and, yes, making one look a bit of a snob. No, there's no avoiding the fact that reading can come across to the average non-reader as a highbrow pastime, even if the book itself isn't necessarily highbrow. Look at it this way. We all know people who would have been decrying the fact that adults cite Eric Carle's magnum opus as their latest and greatest read as sounding snobbish and elitist. And yet, if I was concerned that a friend of mine who was in his 30s was genuinely arguing Teletubbies as the greatest TV show out right now, the world will be on my side for being a little bit worried. Now, I'm not here to talk about why reading has this air about it, perhaps that's for another time, but I am here to talk about the result that got us here. Because it wasn't always like this, was it? You don't need to rewind that far back in time to when it was deemed unusual to not have a book going. You don't need me to tell you what has changed since then, but remember that the humble TV has coexisted very happily with books for a long time. No, what's changed is how we consume our media. TV has changed. Rather than, the increased options, we don't sit through bits of TV we don't watch anymore. We can jump straight in. We can fast forward through adverts. We don't sit through an album of filler tracks anymore to get to the good stuff. We can skip right through it. We don't even need to fast forward. And we don't need to wait until we get home to do any of this. It's all within reach by a device in our pockets. Now, I don't want to sound like a Luddite here. Quite the opposite. I think the digital age has done an amazing good for mankind. And heck, you're drinking in my ramblings right now thanks to these changings. But we have definitely lost something in that transition. We don't put up with filler anymore. If our entertainment doesn't hit our sweet spot, if it's not firing those synapses, we don't have to put up with it anymore. We just move on to something else. But in the pre-digital age, you had to put up with that kind of stuff. You couldn't jump around media like a bee collecting pollen. You had to put up with it to get to the good stuff. So on the whole, while this change has, how we entertain ourselves has been for the better, we've lost a valuable skill. Patience. That willingness to put up with something just that bit longer in case it starts to get good. Watching or listening to something you had no intention of watching or listening, but you have no other choice, and finding you actually really like that thing and thus expanding your horizons in ways you weren't planning or expecting to, rather than today where we can carefully craft our playlists and libraries and habits until we are surrounded only by the genres we love, or at least presume to love. It's this change, this newfound taste for instant gratification of seeking only the things that we want now, that is hurting people's desire to read, I think. Reading requires effort at the best of times, heaps of patience, and putting up with things that we wouldn't necessarily put up with. Now, usually that patience reaps rewards in the form of a slow-burning but deeply satisfying read. But who has the patience or will for that in today's age? Again, I know I'm coming across as an old-fashioned grump when I say this, but I don't say this out of blind favoritism or assuming books are automatically better. They're not. But books can be immense fun to read and worthwhile company, even if they don't reveal their wealth of joy as immediately or obviously as their other entertainment cousins. And I'm going to leave it there for today with part 1 of I Don't Read. Next week, we're going to pick it up with what we can do to change this image. Is it the public perception that needs to change of what reading is and stands for? Or does the writing and reading industry need to change? Perhaps a bit of both. Join me next week for Off the Shelf for part 2. Thank you very much for listening, readers, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.